And hand it over to my very good friend Randy Scheunemann of Orion Strategies, also a longtime supporter and friend of Senator John McCain, who will organize our panel discussion. So Randy, over to you.
Great, thank you, Kurt. The mic is working. Good morning, everyone. We've got an easy topic this morning: Trump administration foreign policy. And to discuss that, and I'm going to try to make this as interactive as possible, short opening statements from each of our very qualified panelists, and then open it up, I hope, to questions and comments from the audience. Starting from my right, Ian Brzezinski of the Atlantic Council, who's going to start us off. James Nixey from Chatham House. Zygimantas Pavilionis from Lithuania, former diplomat and foreign minister, ambassador to Washington. Tsikhelashvili from the Ministry of Reconciliation, Civic Equality in Georgia. I'm going to ask Katie to go second. And Peter van Praagh, who we fortunately, because of switching the schedule, have on our panel. Peter runs the Halifax International Security Forum. The 2016 election was widely heralded in the United States as a dramatic change in both domestic and foreign policy. In the eyes of many, it would be the end of a globalist, interventionist foreign policy and the start of America First, a phrase that has some interesting lineage in American history going back to the 1930s to an isolationist movement. Since the election, we've seen an administration that has used military force in Syria, that signed very serious sanctions on Russia, and has agreed to increase U.S. troop levels in Afghanistan, leading some to wonder, to quote Ambassador Fried describing Wagner, whether the Trump foreign policy is better than it sounds. So to lead us through this, I'm going to ask Ian to start to try to provide a little bit of a framework of Trump foreign policy, what the goals are based on its statements and actions to date, and we'll proceed after Ian. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy, and let me thank the McCain Institute and the EPRC for bringing me to Georgia. Now, I too was impressed by Ambassador Fried's analogy, Wagner. But I'm not as sophisticated as Dan, and I had to turn back to spaghetti westerns. So I thought I'd put the Trump foreign policy in the context of Clint Eastwood's infamous movie, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Going in reverse order, I think of it this way. The ugly is the world vision that President Trump brought to the White House after his campaign. The bad is continued absence of strategy guiding that policy. But the good is the team around him, the national security team that he's built and the actions they've taken. When you look at that world vision, to understand the Trump foreign policy today, you have to look at his starting point. What is the world vision he brought today? And that's encapsulated in two documents, his inaugural address, and then also a statement put out by his advisors Cohn and McMaster later in May, within the first 100 days. And that's a description of a world that's a dystopia. A chaotic world that has wreaked carnage. Remember the phrase American carnage he described in America experiencing his inaugural address. A world in which aggressive enemies, but also exploitative allies, have undermined America has exploited its largesse. There's no global community. It's a competitive landscape. You remember the line from the Cohn-McMaster piece. It says there's no global community, but an arena where nations, non-governmental actors, and businesses engage and compete for advantage. Rather than deny this elemental nature of international affairs, we embrace it. This is a dangerous, apocalyptic world that Trump sees. There's a clear hierarchy of threats. ISIS, North Korea, China, followed by Russia. Allies are seen as temporal, alliances as cumbersome, and to be dismissed in addressing today's challenges. Values were rarely mentioned in the first 100 days as a key objective to support in U.S. foreign policy. So that's the negative. But that world vision has evolved. And it's evolved in large part because the team around President Trump, the McMasters, the Mattises, the Tillersons, the Pompeos, who brought a different view. On NATO, they talked about how important that alliance was in their very first statements when they were getting confirmed. On Russia, they were unambiguous, defining it as the primary, most existential threat to the United States. Their language, including the President's language on Ukraine, has been strong, actually stronger than the previous administration. And look at some of the appointments, one sitting with us today, Kurt Volker, who's unambiguously tough on Russia. Look at the actions that they've taken, particularly in an area that I follow, political military affairs. Right out of the box, they asked for a $1.5 billion increase to the European Deterrence Initiative, the efforts the United States military is taking to reinforce the frontier in Central Europe. EUCOM immediately came out of the box and asked for another armored brigade combat team. The deployments in Europe have featured higher intensity operations, higher intensity exercises, all geared against the Russian threat. These are, I would think, positive, constructive steps in the right direction. But if there's a concern that I have, is a continued absence of strategy. If you look at the policy reviews of this administration, and every new administration undertakes policy reviews, this one, however, has been driven by the dystopic view that Trump has of the world. There's a Russia strategy, there's a Venezuela strategy, a Korea strategy. Strategies all focusing on problems, none of them addressing how to leverage the potentials, the allies, the advantages we have in the world. There's no Europe strategy that I know of, or no Europe strategy review. And until we have a coherent articulation of a clear set of objectives that guides this administration's policy, all this constructive good that we've seen in the past first 100, 200 days of this administration is going to be shadowed by the lurking unpredictability, volatility, and bombast that has characterized much of Trump's rhetoric and some of his actions during his first year.
Great. Thank you, Ian, for a definitely glass half full description of the Trump administration's policy. Katie, Minister, I would like to hear how it looks from here, from Tbilisi. Very successful visit from Vice President Pence. What do you see in terms of the evolving policy of the Trump administration on issues that matter most to Georgia? The occupied territories, with which you're very familiar, Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations, policy towards Russia, and other countries in the neighborhood, whether the neighborhood is the South Caucasus or the Black Sea.
Thank you very much. I thank the organizers, and once again welcome all the guests and friends of Georgia here on behalf of the government. As we're discussing all the topics at this conference this year, and the world being in flux and facing turbulences and many factors of instability, this country where you are here and this region, unfortunately, is no exception because of Russia's destructive policies indeed. And if we can speak of a stability factors that build resilience of my country to carry on with democratic consolidation and economic growth, definitely strategic partnership with the United States is one of the key factors of stability. And the U.S. policy towards Georgia has been a constant for the last quarter of a century. Trump administration not only demonstrated continuity, but introduced a new dynamics, leveling up to a more intense phase. Only in the course of the first 7 months, we had manifold and numerous high-level exchanges that resulted into concrete actions. And you mentioned Vice President Pence visiting in Tbilisi to reaffirm the strongest support of the U.S. in strongest possible terms. Prime Minister Ketevan visiting Washington, D.C. earlier this year in May, etc. I'm not able now to go through all the milestones that matter in this short period of time, but just mention that this strategic partnership is enshrined in the U.S.-Georgia Charter now, which we have in place since 2009, and which kind of frames the spectrum of areas of cooperation from democracy and security to economy, culture, education, healthcare. By the way, I have to mention the hepatitis C elimination program that is funded by the US. It's a tremendous program, saving lives of thousands of people already, people-to-people contacts, etc. And there is a room to advance more, especially in the sectors of economy and free trade. We all understand that economy and trade are driving force for development, not only development, but also peace and security. So we are so happy to welcome the renowned American company operating the Anatlia Deep Seaport, which we just kicked off as a major milestone project to serve as an overland route conjunction of Asia and Europe and increase the role of Georgia as a hub, logistic transportation in this industrial hub. But we also very well understand that the major challenge for security lays just a few kilometers away from the same Anatlia. You spoke about the Russian occupation. The situation on ground is anything but frozen. Russians are regularly boosting up the military presence, conducting over 600 tactical trainings and military drills of a different scale per year in occupied Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Very regularly, including yesterday, are erecting the artificial barriers along the occupation lines that are further isolating these regions and marring the lives of thousands of people living in vicinity. And I'm not talking about the Georgians now, but also very much about the Ossetians and Abkhazians who find themselves under a sweeping Russification, steps that are taken to de facto annexation. And at the end of the day, I mean, of course I can expand and inform you very much in detail of what's going on, but at the end of the day, when you look at this picture, at the security challenges, humanitarian challenges, grave human rights violations, up to ethnic discrimination of Georgians living now in the occupied territories, and everything runs contra to the needs of the population. It does not serve the interests of either Georgians or the Abkhaz or Ossetians. We all suffer. But it's not even a problem of one country, Georgia, and its societies. It's not a problem of this region. It's a problem of Europe at large. It's Russia's very clear strategy of divide and rule, rather try to rule, basically. And longer these conflicts continue to be unresolved, more Russia feels encouraged to try out and replicate the same strategy elsewhere and beyond the region in Europe, because it is a strategy of division and disintegration of Europe. It is a strategy of division and disintegration of Euro-Atlantic bond. And this is why it's so important that Trump and his administration has been so strong, clear, in signaling this is no-go. We heard President Trump saying, calling on Russia, cease destabilizing activities in Ukraine, in Georgia. You have a U.S. envoy to Ukraine. I'm sure you're going to be discussing this over there. We had bipartisan bills and addresses at the Congress, also entailing actions such as curbing budget funding to any government that would recognize the independence of the occupied territories of Georgia. We had the U.S. sanctions codified in the bill and imposed on Russia, underlying that it's inadmissible to continue the occupation of Georgia, etc., and so on. So clarity and action are keywords, and understanding the implications of these conflicts in this area, how they matter for the European security. And clarity and action is something that also needs to be shared across Atlantic, in the Euro-Atlantic community, because neither power policy nor overcautious or unstructured diplomacy can guarantee results against Russian aggression, which is, unfortunately, I again reiterate, quite clear and active in itself. And I think a part of it is to take a joint effort and take steps to the peaceful resolution of the conflict. And of course, you know, here I can talk later about what are the strategies and how do we move with deoccupation, with respect to Russia, with reconciliation when it comes to conflict-split communities, and with overall development of the country and European and Euro-Atlantic aspirations to generate this attraction for those who are now behind the the barbed wires and taken a hostage of the occupation. We enjoy support of the United States in all three dimensions, but of course we look forward of our cooperation, how to address this core problem to European security in an effective way, because we need to address it for the sake of maybe durable peace and stability.
Thank you. I think we can all agree on the need for clarity of action. Ziggy, and I call him Ziggy not just because I'm an American and informal, but because he's been a friend for many years. How does it look from a NATO and EU member, a frontline state, if you will, an administration that seems to be willing to criticize a president, to be frank, willing to criticize members of his own party, including the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader, willing to criticize allies like Angela Merkel, but seems completely unwilling to utter a critical word about Vladimir Putin, a president who has apparently shared code word security information, highly classified, with the Russian foreign minister on a visit, and who, after a meeting with President Putin, at which no note-takers were present, announced that there would be a joint U.S.-Russian cybersecurity panel. These are developments that must be worrisome to Lithuania, to the Baltics, to frankly all of NATO and all of EU. What do you make of the Trump administration foreign policy?
Well, thank you so much. Well, first of all, I think tendencies are quite positive, and I will name few, and I will say how shall we consolidate it. First of all, turning back to Dan Fried words about, it better than it sounds. I think today we have deeds, but not words. Remember well Georgia occupation. We had a lot of hot air, we had a lot of statements, but no sanctions, no punishment. That was a green light for Russia to proceed, to occupy new territories. Today you have sanctions from the very beginning. Actually it started with the end of Obama administration, but Trump did it. Second point, I think we stopped experimenting with Russia. Reset policy that took up to 4-5 years was a difficult and painful experience for my region. We lost a lot of lives, a lot of borders. But what my David Kramer is writing in his book, that's, back to containment, finally. And remember the first meetings of President Obama shaking hands of Mr. Putin in Prague. This time you have first hands from Central Europeans, actually brother of Kaczynski, who was not invited to Prague, and he stayed in Vilnius with my president as a protest to that outrageous invitation of Mr. Putin to Prague. So finally we have America that stays with Central Europeans, and big difference, we have professionals back. Professionals who are friends of Dan Fried, who understand about Europe whole and free, because unfortunately, with Obama people, I had to spend maybe 60% of my life in Washington explaining ABC, why it is needed, and only then planning the actions. With you guys, I can strategize and do the action immediately. What else? Energy security. Back in those years, energy was just in individual actions. Energy was used like a weapon. Now we have a transatlantic energy security. We are building global gas market. LNG revolution is changing the world, and Lithuanians and Poles are taking the lead in that revolution with our LNG terminals and ships from Louisiana arriving to Klaipeda. What else? Defense spending, military presence in our territories. Those are positive tendencies. So now how to consolidate it, how to make it work directly? I'm thinking about the red line drawn very clearly all around Russian territory, to use the words of Dan Fried, to push the Kremlin back. First of all, in Ukraine, lethal assistance, please, now. Because that was long-waited signal. If you draw that line in Ukraine, Russians will be stopped there, for sure. Second red line, Baltic states. Not only kind of temporary presence, but regular and permanent presence of American and NATO troops. Please, that's another red line we have to draw. Third red line is Caucasus, Georgia. Map became an obstacle, not an instrument to achieve a membership perspective. I remember well Bucharest NATO summit with Kurt Wolk and others. We are lying to Georgians for 9 years already. Let's do it. Let's draw the map. And also European perspective. I am waiting for State of the Union address of Mr. Jürgen today. He will be enthusiastic about Balkan EU membership. Why don't we link it to Georgia? Why don't we show that this might be an inspiring example in the Caucasus to draw the line for Russians in that region? And few last soft things, of course, restoring truth-telling infrastructure all around the world. Russians are brainwashing our hearts and brains with their propaganda dramatically and in an outrageous way. Of course, continuing LNG revolution, and then coming back to my last point, what Dan mentioned in the very beginning of his statement yesterday. Look, this is not about geopolitics, not about territories or military and energy interests in Georgia or the Baltic states. This is about values. We want you to be back to who you are. And you are, first of all, democracy. Democracy that should never be taken for granted. So I worked hard to reinstall big democracy into Hillary's administration for 2 or 3 years. I don't see it so clearly in Trump administration foreign policy agenda, and this is insurance for me that finally Trump and his soldiers will die for me and Georgia because of values, because something that we share in our hearts with you from 18th century. Thank you.
Ziggy, thank you for that powerful statement. The first part, I think, if Ziggy is to be believed, the glass is maybe even 3/4 full. James, let me turn to you, and I know you're a specialist on Russia more than a specialist on U.S. politics, which is probably fortunate. But what do you make of the Russia policy? We have an administration that has ignored the invasion and dismemberment of a country that negotiated a one-sided arms control agreement that required the U.S. to cut, but not the Russians, that canceled a missile defense program in Central Europe, that promised more flexibility after an election, and a president that mocked a debate opponent for living in the Cold War. I'm sorry, that was the Obama administration, not the Trump administration. But there has been a lot of noise, to put it mildly, about Russia and what may or may not have happened in the campaign. What has this meant in terms of policy? What will it mean? We can't talk about Russia policy in the Trump administration without mentioning a certain Robert Mueller and his investigative resources and where that may go, which will have a huge impact on foreign policy and the credibility of the administration. So please walk us through what Russia means for the Trump administration foreign policy.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you to the organizers, particularly Kurt, Nino, who I can't see right now, David, Kramer, in absentia, for easily one of the most significant, out of hundreds and hundreds of events in a year, this is easily proven to be one of the most significant and important events on the circuit. Yeah, I'm not known for my half-glass, half-full presentations generally, but I can't help but agree with you and my co-speakers that I think that in spite of itself, that is probably a fair summary. Whatever the Russians were hoping for from this presidency, from this administration, it sure as hell wasn't this. I mean, I was listening to your list, Ian, of things regarding Russia, and I'm afraid, obviously, not having collaborated on what we were going to say, and I certainly had several of the ones that you wrote down. Obviously, sanctions and military strikes on Syrian government targets, Kurt's appointment were all on mine, but you can add to it quite easily. And I think what was high on the Russians' list was Russian prisoners not being released, the Viktor Boats, the Seleznovs of this world. That hasn't happened. Espionage capability from the Russians has been negated, or restricted, I should say, really, with the confiscation of properties and expulsions. And of course, most of all, and I think a grand bargain with Russia, even by stealth, actually, is looking further away than ever before. In fact, it was looking more likely under Obama, considering the the statements that he made towards the end of his presidency. So, I mean, there's no doubt that the shine has come off. If Putin could have been said to have had a good 2016, then I think it must follow that he's had a very poor 2017. Relations are, if not reverting to type, then they are worsening. I don't wish to sound glee about that, but relations are what they are. We're not after better relations for the sake of things. They have to be based upon something. But the fact of the matter is, as Frolov said the other day in Republic.ru, хуже, чем Obama. Whether the Russians themselves believe that Trump has been incapacitated by the deep state, or whether they better understand that America's institutional, constitutional checks and balances on the inappropriate exercise of power have kicked in, I don't know. Some Russians, as far as I speak to them, genuinely believe their own delusions, and some are much smarter than that and don't. But either way, we all know, I think, that this was a systemic response, despite what the president may have wanted. And we certainly see the reflection of that back in Russia, whereby Russian state-approved TV news is running more and more stories which are critical of Trump personally. I think it's important to just, as an addendum, to talk about the economic dimension of the relationship as well, because that is thin, and it's magnified the other problems. The Russian economy doesn't look like it's heading anywhere good. The economies just aren't compatible. Russia doesn't produce anything that the United States wants, and you can't change that. But the Kremlin doesn't understand that. Successive presidents have tried to base better relations on the engine of the economies, but they've been frustrated by the fact that they're just not natural trading partners. The reality is that Russia needs a lot from the United States, but it doesn't have much to offer in return. Perhaps an easier life, but not much. So that's my glass half full, but I can't help but a slight glass half empty. I think you still have some basic problems, which is that Trump and Tillerson are going into bat against the masters, against Putin and Lavrov, and I think they are somewhat outweighted there. Even more importantly, I tend to believe that Russian diplomats outmatch their European and American counterparts in skill, in language ability, in experience, for sure. That's been well documented. And I'm not even entirely sure, for one point I might disagree, but I'm not sure we have entirely stopped experimenting with Russia. I'm always reminded, I'm conscious of the fact that here, love it as I do, we're in a bit of a bubble, and we all are of broadly speaking one mind, and I certainly think that in the policy community in Washington and in London never stops thinking, how can we cooperate, how can we re-engage, what would it take, who must we sacrifice? So I'm not sure of that, but those are my glass half empty parts. But in conclusion, I do broadly agree that the Trump administration makes Russia policy, not Trump. But I think there's twists and turns still to come. I mean, you can't. You mentioned Mueller at the end, and you can't talk about Mueller. But I mean, it appears, as far as I understand it, that the Russian help in the elections was targeted towards areas where Hillary was under pressure. If that can be proven with the demographics, then that's the greatest political crime of the 21st century, and then we really are in collusion territory, which of course was the US intelligence assessment all along. So there's a lot more to come. However confusing it is for us, of course, I would argue that the Russians must be just as confused as perhaps we are. If we've never seen this kind of incoherence before, then perhaps they haven't either. But overall, I think it tells the Russians that they will not be consulted by this administration, which is what they wanted. And the administration doesn't care if Russian feathers are ruffled.
Great. Thank you, James. Peter, I'm going to ask you to clean up a little bit, and let me maybe set the stage just a hint. It can be argued the U.S. has now had 2 presidents in a row, consecutive presidents, that believe the American role in the world either should be reduced or has to be reduced because of factors beyond our control, that the American role in the world isn't, and we keep quoting Ambassador Fried because he's been such a mentor and inspiration to all of us, but that it isn't just a cyclical sag, but in fact a structural change. Can you comment on that and how you look at Trump foreign policy? And I know you've given, as you always do in the lead up to your very impressive conference in Halifax in November every year, you're looking at the agenda and how you put this in context. So perhaps it's appropriate that, I'm very pleased you're able to be on our panel, and appropriate that you can be our final opening speaker.
Randy, thank you very much. Ambassador Dan Fried is here, and people have quoted his quote of saying that Wagner was better than it sounded. And I'd just like to remind everybody that Wagner was Hitler's favorite composer. And I do think that looking at where we are now, we have to listen to the words of the man we are talking about, who is leading the United States, and understand that there is no freedom agenda being led by the United States. To Randy's point, although he did not say it, I would concur that there is a straight line continuation from Mr. Obama to Mr. Trump that a lot of people don't like to admit. But in fact, the way that they're looking at the world is not so far off. I want to take a step back and just say how happy I am to be in Georgia. I used to live next door in Baku, Azerbaijan, many moons ago, and coming to Georgia was always a treat, as it was when I arrived yesterday, because everybody in Georgia smiles, and that is different than many of the neighbors, all of your neighbors, I could say all of your neighbors, and it's a real privilege to be here. I want to thank Nino and the EPRC for putting this together. It's really fantastic. Kurt Volker, thank you for including me. I also want to take a moment just to mention somebody who's not here but whose name has been invoked throughout, and that is Senator John McCain from the McCain Institute. We all know that Senator McCain is facing a serious challenge, and everybody here who I know is a supporter of John McCain and his efforts in Georgia specifically wishes him all the best. I also, and this is relevant, I'm not doing this just, I'm going to come back to it, but I want to acknowledge there's a group of Americans who have really taken Georgia to heart and have helped this country. One of them, my mentor, Ambassador Nelson Ledsky, is no longer with us. Also Ron Asmus, who was my colleague and friend at the German Marshall Fund. Tony Blinken, Bruce Jackson, David Kramer, of course, Kurt Volker, of course, Dan Koonin, Mark Mullen, Ian Brzezinski, and of course, our moderator today, Randy Scheunemann. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. There are a lot of reasons for Georgians to be nervous about the government of the United States of America, and I'm happy to talk about them because I think that everybody needs to be honest with what we are facing. But thinking about this panel, there are at least two good reasons to be optimistic, and I'm going to emphasize them. Neither of these points have anything to do with Donald Trump. Number one, as Honorable Member of Parliament mentioned, is that the United States is a democracy. And the United States is not only a democracy, the United States is a fiercely democratic society. The United States eats its elite for breakfast. And it does that over and over and over again, and we saw it again in 2016, that the attitudes and the opinions of the people of the United States matter. And the people of the United States like fellow democracies. And that is, they like the underdog, they like to support countries that share those values that go back to the founding of the Republic. And that is very important to understand, that whether there is a political leader who does not emphasize freedom or democracy, the people of the United States do care about freedom and democracy. That's point number one, and I urge everybody here to keep that in mind. Point number two, Georgia is a democracy, and that is very important to understand and to appreciate. There are some people who think that Georgia is strategically interesting to the United States because of its geography or because of its commitments in Iraq and what it's done. Georgia is interesting and vital to the United States only insofar that it maintains its democratic culture and its structures and its institutions. I came to Georgia in 1998 to observe an election, and I will tell you that I went to a polling booth and it went like this: Shevardnadze, 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 Joseph Stalin, Shevardnadze. That's not so long ago. And what this country has done since 2000, well, however you want to measure it, but certainly since 2003, is unique in the former Soviet Union, and it's very, very important that everybody acknowledge that, and that the Georgians themselves understand that it is that achievement that makes you relevant in Washington, D.C. The country where I used to work and live, Azerbaijan, that has natural resources, is irrelevant in Washington, D.C. Armenia, next door, that has a large diaspora community, is not a democracy. It does not have the same political leverage that this country has, precisely because of the democratic progress that you have made, and it's very important that everybody understand that and continue that momentum. Without that, the people whose names I mentioned, the Americans who want to help Georgia, and there are those names I mentioned and younger people who want to help this country, cannot. And so long as Georgia stays on the path, the democratic path, those people in Washington who understand that then can communicate it out to the American people, to members of Congress, and ensure that the American body politic continues to support Georgia's independence. And then I'm happy to talk about all of the fundamental challenges that Georgia has, specifically with your northern neighbor, but not only.
Thank you, Peter. I'm going to open it up to questions, and I'm probably going to take a couple. What I ask is that you first identify yourself, and that second, you make your comments brief, and more importantly, you make your comments question, direct them either to specific panelists or to others, and I may exercise the moderator's prerogative at some point and ask questions of my own. Do we have a microphone in the audience? If we do, let's start with Gia right here.
Good morning. Thank you for a brilliant overview. Obviously, I have many questions about...
Identify yourself for those
I'm Gia Nodia, Ilia State University, Tbilisi. I have lots of questions about how Trump administration policies will develop, but I know you don't know the answers either, so I will not ask them. But still, I will ask one question. Okay, so far the impression is, some maybe surprises, that actual policies and deeds of Trump administration contradict in a way his pre-election election campaign rhetoric and maybe his own instincts. So there are deeds, but we are not sure that it's what really Trump would like to be. It's somehow that's some kind of paradox in that, right? And I want to extend this question to this issue of freedom agenda. So we see on the one hand, and it was also clear in this panel, that on the one hand, Trump has maybe unexpectedly firm position in supporting, NATO in this region and things like that. But on the other hand, it has maybe given up on freedom agenda or this aggressive support of democracy, things like that. But if in these more hard security issues, it ended up so that people around Trump did things that maybe Trump did not want in the first place, how big are the chances that this freedom agenda will be still maintained by general, Washington establishment, if you wish, despite Trump instincts? Or it's just gone and it's hopeless. So how we can speak of that?
Got it. Thank you. Let me take a couple. There's one all the way in the back, or most of the way in the back.
Vlagalushka Open Society Foundation. I want to ask a question. So Tom Carruthers in a recent piece said that Trump's election produced sort of this authoritarian relief syndrome in many countries where authoritarian leaders felt that there's going to be less pressure from the United States on whatever domestic practices they deploy. And it's certainly true for a lot of countries that are in democratic transition, that because there is less focus from President Trump on these issues, parts of the societies that are anti-democratic feel that they got suddenly more leeway. And the fact that the democracy promotion agenda is no longer as central, at least at the top level in the US, kind of empowers a lot of these nasty impulses in many countries, which in the end also strengthen Russia's hand because they feed on internal domestic weakness. I was wondering if you could speak to that aspect.
Great, thank you, and I'll take one more from Georgi in the front row here, and we'll have more time.
Thank you. Just very quickly, I'm Georgi Gandeleko with the MP with the European Georgia. When Western leaders, such as Secretary Tillerson, for example, meet their Russian counterparts, even though in this and many other discussions, Georgia is prominently featured, at that level, at the top level, Georgia is not mentioned alongside Ukraine. When Secretary Tillerson, for example, visited Moscow and at the joint press conference with his counterpart, Minister Lavrov, he said that the United States expects Russia to do 1, 2, 3. Georgia is not mentioned in that menu. Nor it is, for example, when President Trump met Minister Lavrov or NATO-Russia Council, and so on, at that level. At levels below, sometimes we hear about Georgia, but at that level, we never hear about Georgia, even though we heard about Georgia even during reset. How would you, and my question would be to Mr. Nixey, and perhaps Minister would like to reflect on that, how could that be explained? Thank you.
Okay, so briefly, if any of our panelists want to address the first two questions, actually very similar. Whether the freedom agenda, is there an authoritarian relief syndrome breaking out around the world because of the Trump election? And then the specific question to James and to Katie, why is Georgia not mentioned more? So very brief, because I'd like to take some more, but let's start with Ian, and we'll just go right in order.
Let me make 2 points on policymaking and the freedom agenda. On policymaking, you got to understand that this administration doesn't have a coherent structure or decision-making process to develop strategy. It continues to be, after about 9 months, ad hocery. Maybe that will evolve as he brings in more personnel and the relationships between his key administration officials consolidate. That's how I would answer the question, why wasn't Georgia on the list? But it's interesting that Pence went to Georgia. which is a reflection, I think, of probably the kind of the emphasis we want the administration to see. On the freedom agenda, think of foreign policy of the Trump administration in two phases. The first 100 days, which was dominated by the dystopic view, the dismissal of NATO, the valueless agenda that Trump brought to the White House. And that was underscored in his inaugural address and the first Cohen-McMaster op-ed, talking about a competitive world. Then you go to the next 100 days, after there have been some personnel changes in the White House. And you have the emergence of perhaps something that's more towards what you're looking for. You have the Warsaw speech, a personal and forceful defense of Western values by the president. A strong reaffirmation of NATO Article 5. He called for and blessed a strong Europe as a positive thing. He called for NATO's adaptation. And then if you look at the Cohen-McMaster piece that followed that speech, the first line of that op-ed is, the United States should be furthering advancing American interests and values and to strengthen our alliances. It went on to say that this is the best possible outcome for America and our allies, and ended by saying our values are worth defending and promoting. Is that a freedom agenda? No. Is it a step towards that compared to the first 100 days? I would say yes. And the challenge before us is to try to further that direction in policy so something more akin to a freedom agenda becomes a defining element of this administration.
James, but just to clarify, Ian, I do believe the affirmation of Article 5 actually did not take place in the Warsaw speech. In fact, reports indicate that the president himself personally struck the words out of the Warsaw speech. But some days later, Brussels, but some days after not mentioning it with the Romanian president, I believe it was something like a hostage statement after all the criticism. The president did utter the magic words about Article 5, not necessarily giving a lot of aid and comfort to people who wondered whether he truly believed it. James?
Okay, thank you. Georgi picked up on my comment that, by and large, Russian diplomats tend to outclass their Western counterparts. Obviously, present company accepted, with Kurt and Dan in the front row here. But there's a very, very good and horrifying article by somebody whose name I can't remember, James, not either of the Jameses in front of me, on the experience differential between Russian diplomats in NATO countries and NATO countries' diplomats serving in Russia, and it's about 1/5, 4/5 effectively in terms of their experience, and it makes quite horrifying reading. Can anyone remember the name of the author? Does that ring a bell with anybody? I'll find it and send it if anybody wants it.
Somebody will Google it.
Yeah. So I do genuinely believe that. So, but I mean, on the second part of your question, Georgi, I mean, why don't we hear about Georgia? I think it's because, I mean, again, it goes back to the point about the bubble. I think people probably don't care. And in that respect, Ukraine's misfortune has been very good for Georgia, because people care about Ukraine. I don't know why that is, if it's size, population differential, geographic proximity, but obviously Georgia's pain is Ukraine's pain. We've had a roughly similar amount of territory stolen, percentage-wise, that is. And so I think that Georgia ultimately will profit from that. But it does tend to be an afterthought in the minds of these diplomats who I'm talking about, who are less experienced, I suppose. Just very briefly on what Geir was saying, and I certainly would agree with everything about you're saying about Trump's sort of impulses, but I think it's worth saying that because Trump certainly doesn't care about Georgia, by the way. I mean, he cares. It seems quite. He perhaps cares a little bit more about Azerbaijan. It's a system he understands a bit more. It's a dynasty. It's a family business. Saudi Arabia, where he's gotten on best, his most successful trip. It's a family business. He understands that. I don't think he understands Georgia quite so well. Oh, and no one's mentioned Tillerson, really, who seems to not be unable to break out from his CEO mentality, unlike some of his senior counterparts.
Great, thank you. And briefly, because I'd like to get at least one more round in, but Zygi.
I don't think that we will be able to change Trump, but we can change ourselves to change Trump. And, paraphrasing Kennedy, don't ask what Trump can do for you, ask what you can do for Trump. And that's easy. I think a reply from this panel, 3 points. Stay the best democracy in the region. Don't kill each other, don't imprison each other, stay united. In the second row, you have 2 Lithuanian prime ministers, conservative and social democrats. They criticize each other like hell, but they stayed together on foreign policy, and that is a tradition of 27 years. Learn from us. Second point, be the best economy. Use reforms. Use the time. You have majority. Be the best. Be Estonians in the region if you want. And third, unite with guys like us and lobby Washington. It would be good to have Poles on board. We do it for Ukraine. We can do it for you. Let's unite like you did it with Vilnius Group. You remember it well. You created it, and we did it. So three things, and Trump will be with us.
I like that. Actually, we're not going to kill each other, definitely assure you, I guess, at least, from my side and our side. So we're having a different ambition, and I think that's a good recipe. But as concerning the question, all my introduction was about to stress that we did get a strong and clear messages of support from Trump administration, perhaps in stronger terms that we may have heard in the continuous policy of the years before. Do we want to be present on all agendas, the high-level agendas? Of course, yes. And this is an effort that Georgia is undertaking, and it also relates to the core question, is the problem in Georgia understood in its full scale? That was another question that I tried to pose during my introduction. Unfortunately, back in 2008, and not to speak about 90s, because actually this conflict dates back to 90s. It doesn't start from 2008. It's a part of the same cycle in Georgia, Moldova, Azerbaijan, Armenia. Now Ukraine has been the last. So understanding sensitivities perhaps were not as much there as we all wish to be. Also in 2008, did we have sanctions on the US? Or did we have rather attempts both from the European partners and the US, which is understandable. Nobody wants war with Russia, neither we do. Kind of to reset, to somehow accommodate, etc., which in Russian translates as a green light. It's a different language, not only literally. It's a different language, different mindset. It translated into green light to Ukraine. And then all the rest has followed, and the Middle East, and today German Interior Minister discusses the possibility of Russian intervention in the German elections, not to speak about what we had in the context of American elections. But, I think a very good thing is that against all the speculations that we had before, concerns that Trump and Putin may, settle all grudges and how the state of the play would be, and whether in this process, Ukraine and Georgia and issues alike would be somewhere ignored or forgotten. It did not happen, and this is very, very important. Of course, the effort is to be taken that we are present at every single format. It needs to be present at every high-level discussion because it matters.
Peter, briefly.
Yeah, very quickly. I'll just say that something is happening inside the United States that and people are trying to still figure it out. Mr. Trump has put his finger on a pulse, but Americans, and you can talk about why, exhaustion after Afghanistan, Iraq, the housing crisis, all sorts of things. Americans are tired, and we have a new president that was elected because of frustrations with how things are going. I would just say that America often is late to show up, but America shows up, and its history proves that it does the right thing. And my guess is that the American people, when confronted with a challenge, a global challenge, are going to encourage this government to follow that tradition of doing the right thing, and leave it at that.
Let me take another another round from the audience. Start right here.
Georgi Ahmeteli, I'm a human rights activist, McCain Institute Fellow. First of all, I want to thank you all for being here and for such an interesting discussion. My question is about the Ukrainian parliamentarian is attending here, and it's interesting what he thinks about it too. What is the chances under Trump administration Ukraine to be supported by lethal weapons, and how can it change the situation there? Thank you.
Great. And then Tom first, and then the gentleman in the red sweater. And I'll take one over here too. So we're going to take 4.
Thanks. My name is Tom Melia. I'm perhaps an interesting American participant in this discussion about different administrations' foreign policies, in that I held a couple of positions in the Obama administration, and I am now a fellow at the George Bush Institute. So I'm respectful of the trajectories of foreign policy in successive administrations. And I want to make 2 quick comments. One is that we saw a bit of a selective memory in describing the arc of America's engagement in the world in the opening set of comments. And I think it's important to remember that every president since Richard Nixon has been elected by promising the American people that he's going to bring America home from extensive overextension in the world and refocus resources on nation building at home. Every single president, including President Bush. He did not get elected in 2000 on a freedom agenda. He got elected saying Clinton had overextended the United States into nation building in Bosnia and Haiti and places of little consequence to the United States. That was the winning argument, in part. So I think it's important to remember that every president gets elected saying he's going to rebuild America first. And then the world throws stuff at us, and stuff happens, and there's a learning curve, and it's usually centered around the president in the administration, who goes from being an American politician to being a global leader. And that's what's happened in each of these administrations. Partly for the reasons that Peter pointed to, that Americans have an affinity for Democrats and underdogs, and they eventually will do the right thing when the world obliges us to do that. But it's never the first instinct of any president. The question here we have, and I think you've answered it more or less, is there going to be a similar learning curve in the Trump administration? All presidents have learned. This president seems resistant to learning. And so it may not matter. He may be a visiting fellow in the U.S. government with interesting ideas, but he's not really involved in making policy. I mean, that's been the upside of most people's comments in this panel so far, is that Trump may have some interesting ideas, but he's not really involved in foreign policy. So either there's going to be a learning curve and he's going to get better at it, or he's going to remain uninfluential in the Trump administration.
Thank you. The gentleman in the red sweater, and then over here.
Thank you. My name is Bacho, a senior of Kennedy School of Government and Practical Political School of Georgia Institute of Public Affairs. And before I'll ask question, I'll be very brief that back in 2015, Harvard's political researcher Graham Allison published a book about U.S.-Chinese trade relations, where he suggested pretty worthwhile concept of so-called Thucydides trap, which is that when a rising power challenges the dominant of an established power, that dominant power is likely to respond with violence. So the question is, will we face this Thucydides trap in Caucasia and precisely in Georgia for our milestones? And will we face a welcome return of history? Thank you.
A welcome return of what? I'm sorry? Oh, okay. And then final question over here.
Hi, yes, my name is Sandra Kaduri. I'm an independent consultant. My question is really about what American people stand for. And you suggested Americans do care about freedom and democracy around the world. But I would suggest a lot of people have been disenfranchised right now in the US and other places in Europe. And my question is, who's representing those people who care about international affairs right now? And who's representing nation states, presidents, parliaments, Facebook? The people themselves have been given a lot of power lately, but do they really have it? Do we need a new construct in democracy to represent people who feel disenfranchised right now? And secondly, in nation states, we do need more leaders to represent the global agenda, the democracy agenda, combat global problems like climate change. Which leaders need to come forward now to push those global challenges and collective responses? Who needs to represent those? Because we do need some more leaders coming forward.
Thank you. And Kurt's starting to signal me, so I'm going to ask each of the panelists, we'll go in the reverse order now, starting with Peter, to fold in any closing comments in addition to addressing any of the questions you wish to address. Lethal arms to Ukraine, learning curve for the president, Thucydides trap, which probably applies a lot more in Asia and the rise of China than it does in this part of the world, and the disenfranchised, and the role of the disenfranchised.
I'm going to very quickly, because I know we're in time, and so it's a difficult one, but you've put your finger on something that's vital, talking about disenfranchisement and a certain frustration. I would suggest to you that the election of Donald Trump might very well be the beginning of the cure of what ails us. How? In the following sense. People are motivated. People are activated. Anybody who did not vote and saw somebody come to office who they didn't think was going to come to office are changing the way they think. And I'll only speak about the United States, but the institutions, there was a lot of alarmism right after the election. Who can control him? The American system works. The checks and balances and the Constitution works, but there are other checks and balances as well, just in terms of the professional civil service. And more than anything else, it's the American people who will wake up and who will legally, whether it's through protest or through different ways, and we'll see. And we'll see how it goes in the midterm elections. The American system is dynamic. On Tom's point and others, I do want to end on a hopeful note, which is this. The President of the United States represents the United States. He has no choice. That's his job. This President of the United States likes to win. And should he understand the challenges that face the United States, and that winning means a win for him and for the people of the United States and, frankly, for the people of the world, he will learn. Because this is not a man who is going to be embarrassed. This is not a man who's going to sit idly by while gains that other presidents might have made fall apart. And so I do think there are some reasons to believe that over the course of time, and he might, I don't know exactly what phrase, but be boxed in to doing some things that people in this room would like to see him do.
Thank you. Katie? Minister, sorry.
Well, I think I would rather make a general concluding comment as I understand, and again, reflect on the Georgia part of the U.S. foreign policy, and again, once again, stress that what we see, it's quite an outstanding cooperation going on a very good track, a rising track, and we look forward for that to continue. This country works very hard for what you spoke today at the panel, for democratic development, for quick economic growth. But we also work for peace every single day. It's easy to say peace is a priority, but it's an everyday job against the background of everyday provocations. When I go out of this room, the journalists might again attack, and something I may not know during these 2 hours may have happened, like yesterday they were digging the ditches along the occupation line in one of the villages that straddles through this village, cuts the farms, blocks the people from access to relatives and lifeline infrastructure. And that's done on purpose, in segments, regularly, to put the pressure on us, not only those families and the farmers on ground, on us, on our way of development, on our choice, not of the government only, but the people. This is the choice for democracy. This is a choice for Europe in the European way of development. This is blackmail. So we are pressured every day to revert from this course. And I would like to make all, I think you do, but again, understand that it's a difficult job to do. And of course we do appreciate understanding of it and standing by in that very difficult task. And this is what we hear from Trump administration so far, and America generally. I mean, as we talk about Trump administration now, but again, as I said, for the last 25 years, as we celebrated the 25 years anniversary of our diplomatic relations recently.
Thank you. Ziggy?
Well, maybe just a general comment. In this room, we have people who had a dream of Europe whole and free, and you made it. And we say thank you. You saved millions of lives, freedom and democracy, but mission is not accomplished. We had some failures on the way. I think now we have a window of opportunity just to accomplish the mission. Do it for Ukraine and Georgia. We will not do it this time for Russians. It will be for our kids to continue, but let's do the job. Thank you.
James? Yeah, super brief. Microphone gone? No. Super briefly, is Trump different? I mean, of course, somebody told me the other day that Trump's superpower is that he does not get embarrassed. That's his one thing. And I would submit, therefore, that if he survives Mueller, if he survives himself, if he survives any other events, dear boy, that crop up, then he has a very good chance of winning in 3 and a quarter years' time. So, and that would strike me as a very reasonable proposition now. I'm aware that everybody has avoided the very difficult question as to will Ukraine be given lethal aid. There is a much better sort of forthcoming panel sitting in the front row who's better qualified to answer that, but I'm aware that front row here has suggested it ought to be, or at least that it should have been given so at the beginning. So that's my cop-out on that question, and it's my closing statement as well.
Ian, I'll be real quick. On Ukraine, I'd say it's 60-40. Remember, in the Obama administration, every cabinet official supported arms to Ukraine, but one person opposed it. We seem to be in a similar situation with Trump, but the question's open, and it's being addressed earlier with very, very strong rhetoric that the president has used in support of Ukrainian sovereignty, not only over eastern Ukraine, but also Crimea. So 60-40. Who's supporting the internationalists in the United States? Right now, clearly, the biggest institution is Congress. Just look at the way they're pushing back against the administration's funding ambitions. Clear example is foreign aid. They want to cut 30%. Congress is going to jam it right back into him. That's checks and balances in play. And third and finally, I said there needs to be a strategy for Europe. So as we look forward, as we see the evolution of Trump policy toward Europe and Eurasia, how would you measure it by? What would be the goals? I'd submit 5. 1, deterring Russia using the West's political, economic, and military capacities. 2, reanimating NATO so that it evolves from an engagement strategy to a true warfighting mindset, i.e. willingness to use force against provocations, against threats much more aggressively than we have in the past. 3, following Zygi, reanimate the vision of a Europe whole, free, and at peace. And that means map for Georgia, long overdue. That means putting Ukraine onto a course towards membership. We're paying the price of pushing these two countries into a gray zone. We've seen 2 invasions as a result of that. We need to move beyond that. 4, reanimating trade talks. And then 5, talking about developing deeper collaboration between the United States and Europe and addressing global challenges, first and foremost CT. Those are 5 parameters for a coherent U.S.-Europe strategy.
Great. Thank you. This year, 2017, marks the 20th anniversary of my first visit to Georgia. I was working for a Senate Majority Leader, but John McCain invited me on a trip when he came here. I believe it was also his first visit. And this is a place, as all of us know, that once you come here, you really in some ways never leave. It's very special, very unique. Blessed to have many friends here, and we certainly had a terrific panel to talk about Trump foreign policy. And please join me in thanking the panel, as well as EPRC and McCain Institute.
And thank you, Randy. That's a great job moderating. If I could ask our audience to stay in place, we're going to have our lunch break immediately following the next panel.